Imagine you are living in the Middle Ages, a world already chaotic enough, and then suddenly someone claiming to be a genius decides to turn everything that has been free for generations into a paid service. From that moment, not only did peasants lament, nobles get angry, but the whole society struggled because of a ridiculous idea that nevertheless changed history. Before we dive into this strange but true story and explore how a reckless decision could turn an entire community upside down, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. That helps me continue bringing you the most fascinating historical secrets. And while watching, don't hesitate to comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I really enjoy connecting with people all around the world. Now let's follow along to the end of the video to see how this absurd event made the Middle Ages so chaotic. If there is anything that made the Middle Ages special, it was not the lack of creativity among the nobility, but rather their excessive creativity. Every time a peasant found a way to survive without going bankrupt, some lord somewhere would feel personally offended. It was as if the mere existence of ordinary humans was an undefined crime. And so the beginning of every tragedy started with a sentence: "Wait, this is still free?" That question was the moment all the trouble began. Because for the ruling class of the Middle Ages, anything free was dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of causing explosions, but dangerous in the sense of if they don't pay us, they will think they are important enough to not need us. A horrible thought, a threat to social order, a perfect reason to invent a few more types of fees. So began the series of bizarre economic inventions. Let's talk about, for example, for centuries, peasants rested on windowsills, on stones, or directly on the ground, a simple, healthy act that didn't affect anyone. But then an amateur night entrepreneur rode past the village, saw peasants resting after 10 hours of hard labor, and immediately felt annoyed. They are enjoying comfort, he thought, and I'm not getting a single coin. Just a week later, a new decree was issued: a seating tax. Yes, sitting down meant paying a fee. Standing up also required payment because it tired the ruler's eyes. In some regions, people had to register for a resting permit, a scribbled paper confirming that the peasant was allowed to relax their spine for 3 minutes as long as a guard was present. Poorer areas, lacking personnel to supervise, went further and posted signs everywhere. Sitting without permission equals blasphemy against God. And so everyone stood, standing while working, standing while eating, standing while listening to stories. Some clergy said it was good for the spirit. Others stood helplessly because they were not exempt from the tax either. Unbelievably, things got worse when they discovered air. Not in the sense of carbon taxes or emissions like today, though the idea was similar. No, the Middle Ages were much simpler. One lord climbed the city wall, took a deep breath, and said, "What a fine, clean air. Belongs to me." The next morning, the people of the region received a notice about the seasonal breathing fee. Officially, the populace had to pay to contribute to the purity of the air, even though no one thought the Lord had anything to do with it. Some villages even categorized different types of breathing: normal breathing, 1 penny; deep breathing to relieve stress, 2 pennies; breathing out of fright when seeing a guard, free, because it amused them; breathing while sleeping, paid monthly, discounted if snoring loudly. This taxation method only stopped when a burly man accidentally held his breath too long to avoid paying and passed out in the market. No one saved him, but they were fined for disrupting economic activity. Then came sunlight, something everyone thought was completely free. They were wrong. One lord took a morning walk, noticed the sun shining on his courtyard looked better than the village, and immediately concluded that the sunlight on his estate was of higher quality. Middle Age logic was clear. If it shines on my land, it belongs to me. And thus was born the sunlight tax. Peasants had to pay to dry rice, dry cloth, sunbathe themselves, or even dry the faint hopes remaining in their hearts. Many poor families had to live in darkness all summer, becoming gloomy shadows wandering the fields. In some regions, they were more creative and charged for casting shadows. If your shadow fell on the Lord's land, you were occupying property by projection and had to pay a fine. Some desperate peasants tried walking at noon to shorten their shadows, but the guards quickly issued standard shadow height regulations, making all efforts useless. And then there was a completely absurd but common fee, the existence tax. This was the pinnacle of Middle Age financial creativity. By law, everyone living on a lord's land had to pay for the privilege of existing on his estate. It was like rent, but expanded to your entire body and breath. Some regions even sent notices specifying anyone existing today without prior notification will incur a late existence fee. In that context, it is not hard to understand why peasants in the Middle Ages were always frowning, or why half whispered, half prayed curses were created at lightning speed. They were not angry about poverty. They were angry because every time they found a small joy, someone would immediately ride by and turn it into a premium service. And that is the beginning of the story, the era when greed began reshaping everyday life, bit by bit. When everything that once belonged to the community was reduced to the property of a few powerful people, the populace had to learn to live in a new world where every action had a price, and every price was absurd. From the moment the rulers discovered that charging for things that were inherently free could bring endless profit, medieval society entered a new era, a time when absurdity was no longer the exception, but policy. Grazing rights were just the next brick on that endless road. When the noble declared that all grass from real to imagined belonged to him, the peasants felt as if they had been thrust into a universe where logic committed suicide in the very first chapter. At first, they tried to cope with patience, a quality they had been trained in all their lives thanks to harsh winters and sudden tax hikes. They attempted to argue that grass grew naturally, that they cared for the land, that their livestock simply lived according to survival instincts and not to sabotage the feudal economy. But arguing with a medieval noble was no different than arguing with a goose. It honked louder than you, wandered aimlessly, and was absolutely certain it was right. From there, a series of new regulations was issued with the enthusiasm of someone discovering power for the first time. First, any animal standing on the Lord's land had to pay a grazing fee, whether it was eating, sleeping, or merely standing there pondering the meaninglessness of life. Some lords went further, adding fees based on the weight of livestock, because in their view, the fatter the animal, the more it ate, and thus the more damage it caused to their precious grass. No one could explain why precious grass looked identical to weeds, but once it was given a fancy name, it became grounds for taxation. The next problem arose quickly. Livestock cannot read warning signs. Even the most honest cows would inadvertently step over boundaries and were immediately considered economic criminals. Peasants had to pay a voluntary ransom to rescue their livestock to avoid being accused of murdering the Lord's property. One family was even charged with inciting illegal grazing after their cow glanced at the fence more seriously than usual. Of course, God did not joke about grass. The absurdity continued to spread like a plague. Some lords began charging based on the number of chewing sounds a cow made within their land, claiming that chewing was also a form of resource use. One particularly creative noble even proposed taxing the shadow cast by livestock on the grass because shadows prevent the grass from photosynthesizing. The only scientific reasoning of that era was that anyone could make a claim as long as they owned a sword and a castle. Then came an even more dreadful invention, the wind tax. Not storm winds, not rain-bearing winds. Any wind blowing across a lord's land was considered a property cooling service, right? And peasants had to pay if they wanted to enjoy the wind. They weren't requesting to enjoy anything at all, but the wind still blew, and the lord still demanded payment. The peasants could do nothing but stand there, shivering in the wind they had not rented. And as with all medieval absurdities, when one person did something ridiculous and made money, the rest of the nobles immediately copied it. They competed to invent new types of fees, standing on land, sitting on land, having shadows fall on land. One lord even declared a tax on the right to breathe fresh air, arguing that the air on his land was purer than neighboring areas, even though no one could tell the difference. Medieval peasants thus became inadvertent mathematicians, constantly calculating how much each step, each animal, each breath would cost. Some began keeping careful records just to know whether leading the cows to the fields would bankrupt them. Their lives became an endless series of unanswered economic questions. If my cow eats 3 tufts of grass, how much do I pay? If the wind blows twice today, do I owe extra? If it rains while the cow is eating, which fee takes priority? No one had answers, not even the lawmaker. These were laws meant to intimidate, not to be understood. And when grazing rights turned into an unfair game, the people had to adapt. Some secretly led livestock to feed at night, hoping darkness would conceal even the chewing sounds. Others secretly grew grass indoors, turning windows into secret pastures, even if it made suffocation more likely than enrichment. A few desperate ones tried to teach cows to evade taxes, a task that failed miserably because cows do not fear the law. But the scariest part was not the injustice of the regulations, but the speed at which they spread. Once those in power realized that nature could become a bill, they immediately viewed the world through the eyes of tax collectors. Grass was no longer grass, rain was no longer rain, wind was no longer wind. All became opportunities. Medieval society, already poor and harsh, turned into a game in which the players could only lose. Because in that era, the most dangerous thing was not hunger, disease, or war, but a bored and imaginative noble. You might think those absurd fees were just a few isolated accidents in history, but in reality, they marked the beginning of a much more dangerous trend. Anything could become private property if the powerful were greedy and had enough free time. Before long, across medieval Europe, a series of bizarre fee inventions began to appear, so strange that a modern reader can only look up to the sky and exclaim, "This can't be real." But it was real and even worse than you think. Some lords, realizing that controlling grass, beer, or forests didn't seem to extract enough wealth, expanded their vision to even more unbelievable things. For example, the right to breathe in a specific space. In some regions, markets were so crowded that a lord devised a new way to make money, charging a fee to set up a stall, a fee to stand near a stall, and even a fee for the right to use the air in the trading area. Of course, they didn't call it that directly. They used fancier terms like commerce order maintenance fee. But the villagers knew exactly what it meant. They were paying to exist within 3 meters of their own basket of carrots. And what about the peasants who refused? Simple. They were thrown out of the market by guards wielding spears longer than the villagers' patience. The medieval people were not many, but they were certainly persistent, and they needed it because this fee system continued to spread like mold on winter bread. Meanwhile, the people clung to the small joys that remained, little festivals, singing around the campfire, or market gatherings full of laughter. But even those fragile moments were noticed by those who saw life only as a spreadsheet of profit. Spring festivals had once been occasions for people to temporarily forget the hardships of life. But then someone thought it wise to charge a fee to enter the village during the celebration. Each person had to pay a small amount to pass through the wooden gate they walked through every day. When villagers protested, the town council coldly replied, "To maintain community culture, everyone must contribute." In other words, want to have fun? Pay up. The irony was that those collecting the fees didn't contribute anything to maintaining the festival, except standing at the gate and glaring at anyone attempting to sneak past. A few daring individuals tried climbing the walls. They quickly realized that rotting boards were not reliable allies. The only interior they saw that day was the small, makeshift room guards used to detain offenders. And while the villagers struggled to protect what was rightfully theirs, the ruling class continued to devise new ways to turn life into an endless string of bills. A prime example was the bridge fee. Not a large stone bridge, not a massive architectural work, but any plank placed over a narrow stream that even a goose could cross without getting its feet wet. Some places even charged for shade. A noble built a small tower, tall enough for its shadow to fall on the main road. Anyone passing through that shadow had to pay for, enjoying the coolness. The funny thing was that the tower had no purpose other than casting a shadow to collect money. It wasn't a fortress, it wasn't a warehouse, it wasn't even habitable. It was merely a gigantic toll structure, rising to the sky like a declaration. I will charge for everything, even what you cannot hold. But the absurdity didn't stop there. Some regions even imposed an inheritance fee, an amount a child had to pay the lord to inherit their parents' belongings. This turned every death into a nightmare inventory, with guards rifling through homes, deciding whether a cracked ceramic vase was valuable enough to levy a few extra pennies. Many families became so desperate that they hid their belongings in pits behind the house, hoping rain wouldn't wash away the traces. They weren't hiding gold or silver. They hid spoons, water jugs, and sometimes even the family's only pair of shoes. Like grass, forests, and beer, the idea of the inheritance fee was not based on fairness or order. It was based on a cruel truth. Power can turn anything into income if unchecked. And for those struggling day by day to survive, these fees were not just a financial burden. They were a reminder that their lives, every breath, every step, every small moment of joy, could be taken away if someone above desired it. But peasants never fully submitted. They created secret networks of help, trading food outside the market to avoid fees, holding small festivals in backyards, gathering to drink homemade weak beer without leaving a trace. Individually and in groups, they tried to reclaim the fragments of a free life their ancestors once had. And it was precisely this persistence, not taxes or laws, that kept medieval society from completely collapsing. Every small act, from sneaking into the forest to gather herbs to sharing beer over a fence, was a silent vow that greed could not govern everything, that humans, even when pushed to the limit, would find ways to survive, share, and resist absurdity using whatever tools they had: perseverance, cleverness, and sometimes a sweet kind of daring. As absurd fees spread throughout the Middle Ages, people began to realize that the lords didn't just want to control land or crops. They wanted to control even the most ordinary human habits. And once power reached habits, nothing was safe anymore. Even basic activities like moving around, eating, cooking, or trading became a series of ridiculous negotiations with officials who often didn't even understand themselves why they were collecting money. But that was precisely what made the Middle Ages a paradise for minds that loved absurdity. Take a simple example: moving around the village. You might think walking is the most natural form of human movement, but for the nobility, if they couldn't make money from you lifting your foot, it automatically became a problem. So, in many regions, new fees began to appear: a road usage fee, a passing through the village fee, and in some places, even a fee for standing too long at a point under the Lord's protection. The official reason? Road maintenance. The real reason? The Lord discovered that peasants couldn't fly. The paradox lay in the fact that these roads had never been repaired, never paved with stones, and certainly never cleared. They were muddy in winter, dusty in summer, and frequently capable of swallowing an unsuspecting pig. And so anyone daring to set foot on the Lord's road was required to pay a fee equal to half the money they didn't have. Every step served as a reminder that freedom of movement was never free for those living under someone who had never been busy in their life. Similarly, cooking became a field full of creative fees. Not only were ovens monopolized, but many places also imposed a fire usage fee. They argued that creating fire, a basic and instinctive human act, had to be supervised by the Lord. People were required to light fires only at certain hours, with approved wood and in designated locations. If smoke drifted toward the tax collector's house, they were fined for mental pollution. Not environmental pollution, mental pollution. A concept invented to justify collecting extra money. In some places, there were even patrols that listened to the sound of pots and pans. If a family stirred soup too vigorously, producing noise beyond the allowed limit, they could be taxed for disturbing the Lord's peace. Every little thing could become a reason to collect money. And if no reason existed yet, one would be invented entirely. This led to one of the most comically tragic aspects of the Middle Ages. Free trade almost didn't exist. Markets, once places where people exchanged goods, shared news, and complained about the weather, gradually became places where sellers had to assess their finances even before displaying goods. Not because they feared loss, but because simply entering the market became a strategic financial decision. And the greatest irony of all, the lords provided no benefits or protection commensurate with the money they collected. If if there was theft, it was the villagers' fault for not being vigilant. If there was disease, it was because God was testing them. If the market caught fire, it was the will of heaven. But if a coin fell to the ground, that was the Lord's property, naturally. All this forced people to find creative ways to avoid taxes. Some began organizing secret exchanges in the forest at dawn. They traded turnips in whispers as if exchanging national secrets. Others built illegal bridges, essentially two stones placed close together, to avoid crossing the main bridge. Some even waded through mud, clinging to tree roots, and battled wild geese just to keep a few coins. But all these efforts couldn't stop the larger trend. The nobility was learning to commercialize everything, not because they needed money, but because they couldn't bear to see peasants enjoying pleasure, convenience, or freedom without going through them. By the end of the Middle Ages, one thing became clear. Fees and taxes were not just tools of control, they were a philosophy of life, a philosophy that stated that anything not taxed could not last long. Every bridge, every market, every oven, every ritual, every trip, every pot of soup in the kitchen, everything became part of a system where power was measured not just by land, but by the number of fees a lord could invent out of boredom. And that is the comical tragedy of the era, a society where creativity did not lie in art, literature, or architecture, but in finding more ways to charge the poorest people. As the Roman siege tightened around Jerusalem, Legio Kix was no longer merely an army. They became a colossal machine driven by ruthless patience. Every step, every spear thrust, every hammer strike conveyed the sense that the legion was not conducting a military campaign, but writing a chapter of history in fire and steel. Jerusalem, once a sacred city, transformed into a battlefield where the wills of both sides collided amid falling stones and clashing swords. In the early days, the Romans observed, not the idle observation of a passerby in a market, but the kind of observation by those mapping the psychology of their opponent. They wanted to know how high the walls were, where archers hid, who entered and exited the gates, and most importantly, the strength of the defenders' morale. They realized Jerusalem was not just a city with formidable walls, it was a symbol not easily shaken. The defenders did not fight merely to hold their homes, they fought to uphold faith, and in antiquity, faith could be stronger than steel. Titus and his commanders understood that a hasty attack would turn everything into disaster. So they did what Rome had long perfected as an art: tighten, constrict, then suffocate. Siege works began to rise everywhere. Towering siege towers, assault ramps built from wood and earth, and massive barriers preventing anyone from escaping the city. Every day, the defenders looked out and saw Legio X's presence growing ever larger, as if the very ground sided with Rome. However, the Jews were not easily defeated. They launched numerous sudden strikes, set Roman siege works on fire, and used the city's complex terrain to confound the invaders. Long nights echoed with shouts, clashing swords, and small groups of troops emerging from secret gates only to vanish before the Romans could respond. Legio Kex, hardened by the smoke, waves, and storms of Caesar, remained unshaken, but it was clear they understood this battle would not be easy. The turning point came when Titus ordered the construction of a circumvallation, a daring military feat of antiquity. The Roman legion built a massive wall surrounding Jerusalem's walls. It was an unspoken declaration. If you wish to hold out, we will turn your defense into a grave. They completed this construction in just a few days, a feat showcasing the steel discipline of Legio Kex and its supporting legions. From that point, all hope of resupply vanished. Legio X soldiers watched from high towers as the city gradually fell into darkness, deprivation, and division. Hunger and thirst destroyed any defenses faster than spears could. Jerusalem's inhabitants' perseverance earned Roman respect, but courage could not replace bread, and zeal could not replace water. As the Romans approached the outer walls, Legio Hex led the way. They erected siege towers, attempting to bring them close to the walls while arrows, stones, and boiling oil rained down. At times, the towers were set aflame, forcing soldiers to rush into the inferno to save them, as if saving the legion's honor. These were not mere siege works, they were symbols of Roman pride. Every stone placed on the assault ramp was a statement that Rome never stopped when it decided to take a place. Then the walls were breached, not by a single blow, but through thousands of hours of tireless labor, hundreds of skirmishes, and countless sacrifices. When the first section fell, Legio Tech's soldiers did not cheer. They had no need to. For them, this was merely the next step in an inevitable process. Crossing the breach, The legion faced not only the enemy, but the very labyrinthine structure of Jerusalem. The ancient city, with its narrow streets and tangled constructions, turned every corner into a potential ambush. Yet they pressed forward. Every house captured, every alley controlled, they etched their names deeper into history. The intensity of the fighting increased daily. Defenders fought with utmost desperation, while Legio Hex responded with the cold resolve of a force convinced nothing could stop them. Titus, from his command position, witnessed the fierce resistance to the extent that even he had to acknowledge the enemy had fought with all their faith. But he knew the end was only a matter of time. As the siege entered its final phase, Legio X no longer fought merely as a unit. They fought as a symbol of the Empire. Every order executed with the precision of cogs in a massive machine. They breached gates, scaled walls, repelled counterattacks while the city descended into chaos. No one in the Legion forgot they were Caesar's favored, warriors honed in storms, who had fought on both land and sea. Jerusalem was only the next challenge, but a challenge that would imprint itself on the world's memory more than any battle they had fought before. And as they advanced into the city center, what followed was not merely victory, but a dark milestone, a reminder that Rome's power lay not only in glorious feats, but in its ability to crush any opposition. As the flames gradually consumed the heart of Jerusalem, Legiox understood that they were standing in a moment that would echo through history, not merely as a battle, but as the end of an era. Black smoke rose from the temple, spreading across the sky, forming a grim curtain over the dying city. Yet beneath that curtain of ash, the fighting did not cease. If the walls were the protective skin, and the temple the sacred heart, then the cluttered streets ahead were the last veins of the rebelling populace. And those veins were still writhing in resistance. The Romans, though long accustomed to bloody campaigns, still felt the weight of this moment. Veteran soldiers who had survived Germania, Britannia, and Numidia realized Jerusalem was a wholly different challenge, not just because of the ferocity of the enemy, but because of their will, a stubborn and desperate force as immovable as rock on a mountainside. Every Jewish warrior cornered fought as if their world depended on every strike of the sword, every arrow, and in a sense, it did. They were not only defending a city, they were defending memory, faith, and an identity nurtured over generations. Meanwhile, Legio X moved like a machine honed by decades of experience. Each step was a blend of violence and discipline. They broke through hastily built wooden walls, climbed collapsed stairways, and tore down defensive lines that the rebels continually rebuilt in desperation. Officers trained their voices to shout over the crackling of burning wood and the clash of weapons. The leaders knew that if their formation broke, they would be swallowed by this blazing labyrinth, shot from narrow windows, or torn apart by sudden attacks from unforeseen corners. The fire continued to spread. As the wind blew, new flames erupted from windows, turning many alleys into smoke-choked tunnels. The Romans knew that fighting in fire was a gamble with their lives, but retreat was not in their vocabulary. Many soldiers used water-soaked cloaks to shield their heads, crouched low to avoid smoke, and pressed forward amidst the screeching of cracking hot stones. They survived by instinct more than tactics, yet that instinct had been sharpened through years of warfare. As the siege tightened around the western courtyards of the temple, the rebels' desperation reached its peak. They understood that losing this area meant total collapse was only a matter of time. So they gathered every man still able to bear arms, from seasoned warriors to craftsmen unaccustomed to killing, creating a fierce wave of counterattacks. These attacks were not sophisticated, but they carried the energy of people who knew they had no tomorrow. Many charged directly into the Roman lines only to be crushed, but every moment they bought allowed other groups to rebuild barricades, pour water onto roofs, or try to salvage holy relics before the flames destroyed everything. Legio Kex fought not only with swords, but against the furious forces of nature itself. Burning wooden beams falling from roofs injured or trapped many soldiers. Engineering squads had to drag collapsing houses aside to clear a path for the advancing ranks. Even the most experienced officers admitted they had never witnessed a battle so chaotic and yet so mentally taxing. Yet the defenders' collapse gradually became evident. Each time they sallied from an alley to counterattack, fewer returned. Survivors bore red, smoke-stung eyes and exhaustion from hunger and thirst. Many fought by sheer will alone. But will could not stop the Roman swords. As the skirmish reached the area near the temple's final courtyard, the space was almost unrecognizable. Burned paving stones turned black. Jerusalem's once white walls became mottled gray. And amid the ruins, Legio Hanks saw what they had been waiting weeks for, the first sign of the defenders' spirit breaking. A large group of rebels was finally cornered in a burned courtyard. They stood in a desperate circle, backs to the walls, not eyes peering through smoke at the approaching Roman ranks with ash-covered shields. No one fled, no one surrendered. They only cried out their final prayers, and Legio X answered with cold silence. The next advance of the legion no longer felt tactical. It felt inevitable, as if the entire city was gasping beneath them, waiting only for the final blow to end its prolonged suffering. Outside, the temple's fire still roared. Inside, the clashing of steel gradually thinned, both merged into a funeral dirge for a crumbling culture. And when the Romans finally swept away this line of defense, Jerusalem, the city that had proudly defied an empire, finally knelt. By the 12th century, Europe seemed to have shaken off the ashes of the preceding period of decline. Yet in reality, the world was changing in ways no one could predict. Small towns, once familiar only with church bells and wheat fields, had become testing grounds for an entirely new type of society, one where commerce, competition, and cunning coexisted alongside morality and faith. And within this context, the long shadow of old Rome, with all the control, discipline, and order it had once represented, suddenly became a familiar reminder that many did not even realize they missed. The paved roads, once a testament to Roman engineering, were now crowded with peasants, merchants, beggars, and even cunning opportunists. A new class emerged, the townspeople, neither noble nor serf, but possessing a completely new power, the power of money. They owned flower shops, blacksmith workshops, warehouses of exotic spices, and occasionally secret storerooms that no one wanted to speak of. As cities rose like living organisms, the old rules began to become obsolete, and what had once been considered universal rights, like well water, communal ovens, or the right to pass through city gates, suddenly became targets of a very new mindset, the mindset of charging fees. No one knows exactly who first came up with the idea of charging for things that were originally common property, but historians of the time agree that it arose from a peculiar kind of genius, someone intelligent enough to be dangerous, yet not wise enough to know when to stop. A person too skilled at calculation, but lacking the ability to understand others. In ancient records, he appears as a shadowy figure, with various names attributed: the fee collector, the innovator, the destroyer of tradition, even the madman. Only one thing is certain: he changed the way towns operated. At first, the charges were very small: 1 coin to use the public oven, half a coin to draw water from the city well, a percentage of goods value for the gatekeeper. Most people shrugged it off. "What's a few coins?" they said. "It's nothing." But as with all fee systems that have ever existed, these small amounts quickly grew into something that devoured a culture. When one person successfully charged a fee, others began to imitate, not because they needed the money, but because they feared being left behind in the new game of the world. From then on, European towns fell into a strange state, a form of organized chaos. Fees upon fees, taxes upon taxes, and every street, every turn became a trap set by clever but entirely unkind minds. Ordinary people, those who did not even understand why things were changing so quickly, began to complain, then to get angry. But discontent was unorganized. No one led them, no one guided them in resistance, and in the end, they had to accept a new reality. Everything had a price, even things no one had the right to own. This transformation was not merely economic, it was a crack in the very mental structure of medieval society. Europe had once been built on the idea that everything belonged to the community: communal ovens, pastures, wells. But as the mindset of charging fees spread, the notion of commons gradually disappeared. Cities began erecting fences around wells, locking gates to pastures, and even hiring guards to watch places that once belonged to everyone. As these changes spread to larger communities, lords and mayors began to smell opportunity. They issued new decrees, established new positions: the gatekeeper, the market supervisor, the street tax collector, And like a poisonous tree taking deep root, the new system, a system where power was measured by the ability to profit from things no one had created, became the foundation of social order. Yet not all accepted this. In more remote villages, in smaller communities, elders looked back to the past with the unease they could not express in words. They remembered the time when Rome maintained order through law and legions, and though sometimes ruthless, it was fair in a certain sense. Rome took much, they said, but at least they built more. Now, those taking from them, the new fee collectors, built nothing but notices and tax warehouses. The irony lies there. Rome once ruled by force, but the 12th century was ruled by the warped wisdom of a new era where legions were unnecessary, for the people themselves bowed to a system they did not understand but continued to sustain. That was when the real story began. For what happened next not only changed social structures but also laid the groundwork for the modern economy. From a single idea, an idea either foolish or genius, depending on your judgment, Europe had plunged into an era where everything had a price, even things previously decided only by heaven. Medieval guilds did not merely create rules, they built invisible walls around the marketplace, walls so high that only those they permitted could pass through. And from here, the story becomes much more interesting. When guilds realized they could protect their trades from outside chaos, they also discovered something even more powerful: control. Not control based on swords or armies, but control based on what the medieval mind understood best: monopoly. In crowded markets where merchants from 3 or 4 nations argued in 3 or 4 languages simultaneously, the guild's imprint was unmistakable. The wine seller could only sell wine if he paid dues to the guild. The cloth seller used the guild's standard weights, not his own. And the blacksmith, a figure always seen as a symbol of physical strength, could not set up a forge on any street without the guild's approval. They did not merely produce iron and steel, they created order, and that order bore the guild's mark so strongly that townspeople believed the town would collapse without them. But what made this system truly astonishing was how it intertwined with the daily life of ordinary people. You could not buy a loaf of bread, pull a length of fabric, or repair a barrel without interacting with the guild's influence. Every product in the market carried a story. The story of an apprentice who grew up in the workshop, of a skilled craftsman bringing techniques back from a distant town, and of a master who proved his ability through a flawless masterpiece. Goods sold were not merely products, they were collective honor. And because of that honor, guilds became massive operating systems beyond anyone's imagination. They controlled raw materials, controlled prices, controlled the number of shops allowed to operate in the same trade. If you think this sounds like modern corporations, you would not be wrong. The only difference was that instead of luxurious boardrooms, guild meetings took place in churches, taverns, and sometimes in small rooms where the light of oil lamps made the space feel both solemn and strangely intimidating. But that power was not merely economic. Guilds also became the center of social life. You could imagine a town parade with people lined up along both sides and each craft group marching forth like an honor guard. The shoemakers carried the symbol of their trade. The blacksmiths carried hammers. The goldsmiths carried shining silver boxes. For them, it was not just a festival, it was a declaration of existence. We are the keepers of order. We are the foundation of the town. They also cared for each other like a family. Injured workers received support from the guild. Children of members found apprenticeship easier. Families of deceased members could receive small allowances from the common fund. This bond was so strong that many said being a guild member was even more important than belonging to one's family or village. Yet, like any system of power, guilds were not always perfect. When power grew large enough, protection easily became a barrier. Young innovators wanted to experiment with new methods. The guild blocked them. Immigrants bringing new techniques from distant lands, the guild prevented them from opening workshops. Poor people wanting to improve their lives by learning a trade, the guild could say no if you had no sponsor. Some guilds even set rules so meticulous that outsiders felt as though they were reading magical laws. Some dictated the number of nails on a shoe. Some limited the number of craftsmen allowed to operate in a street. Some imposed harsh penalties on anyone opening a workshop before the permitted hour, simply because it caused unfair competition. But what allowed this system to endure for centuries was the strange balance between control and protection. In an era when robbery, unpredictable prices, and counterfeit goods spread like a plague, the guilds provided what medieval people desired most: trust. You knew you could buy a sword that would not break in battle. You knew the fabric you paid for would not fade after a few weeks. You knew a loaf of bread would weigh exactly as the law prescribed. And for merchants, that meant profit. For townspeople, it meant safety. For the town, it meant prosperity. That is why, as guilds grew stronger, no one opposed them. They were seen as protective barriers against chaos and sometimes even against local authorities. Some towns even feared guilds more than the local lord, because the guilds were the true economic regulators. And here lies the greatest paradox of the Middle Ages. These guilds were born from the fear of losing freedom, yet ultimately became organizations capable of controlling freedom more than anything else. They solved the problem of excessive freedom by creating a system in which nothing was allowed to escape its framework, a system that both protected honest workers and locked the door against anyone who wanted to enter without certification. Yet despite this strictness, guilds remained the driving force behind the growth of large cities, the construction of massive cathedrals, the development of intercontinental trade, and the ushering of medieval Europe into a new era. Every brick, every bridge, every prosperous city bore their mark. Because at the heart of every guild, whether blacksmith or goldsmith, was the human element. People who wanted recognition, wanted to protect the honor of their trade, wanted to believe that their skill had value. And it was this pride, not dry regulations, that allowed the system to endure for so long. As guilds grew powerful, they were no longer merely organizations protecting the quality of trades. They became sophisticated economic and political machines, where every decision about production, pricing, and market control reflected internal power. This rise transformed medieval towns into a tightly knit network, where every street, every stall, every workshop fell under the guild's supervision. Ordinary people might think they were just buying a loaf of bread, a pair of shoes, or a sword, but in reality, they were participating in a complex system of power where every action, every product, and even social relationships were shaped by the guild. This created extraordinary stability, but one full of tension. For customers, the guild was a shield against chaos. No more worry about spoiled bread, torn clothing, or fragile tools. Yet behind that stability were rigid barriers. Outsiders, no matter how talented or creative, could not open a workshop, practice their craft, or almost survive in the local market without approval. Guild members patrolled the market, inspected goods, weighed and measured, and even punished the smallest infractions that could disrupt balance. This power both protected and threatened, creating a complex relationship between monopoly and individual freedom. Guild control was not limited to products, it even influenced town planning. Some streets were reserved for specific trades: Goldsmith Street, Butcher Street, Shoemaker's District. This was no coincidence, it was a power strategy. When all trades were concentrated, the guild could monitor and protect the entire production chain while controlling commercial conflicts before they became major disputes. Controlling geographic locations provided both convenience and authority. These streets became centers of power where craftsmen not only practiced their trade, but also built prestige, demonstrated skill, and expressed loyalty to the guild. Beyond economics, guilds were intertwined with the spiritual life of the city. Each trade had its patron saint, rituals, and traditional feast days. Bakers revered Saint Honoratus, masons worked under the protection of the Virgin Mary, goldsmiths honored their trade's patron saints. These rituals were not just religious expressions, they were spiritual pillars, offering comfort amidst disease, war, famine, and fire. When guild members gathered to pray, they did not see competitors. They saw brothers in the craft, sharing pride and responsibility. Guild feasts were another demonstration of the blend of power, order, and social cohesion. Tables of roasted meat, fragrant bread, and barrels of beer were funded by membership dues and fines. These events were not just meals. Seating arrangements, the order of service, and organization reminded everyone of hierarchy and rank within the trade. Masters sat at high tables, journeymen in the middle, apprentices on the edges. Every action, blessing, prayer, or song emphasized that this was an organized system where honor and reputation mattered above all. Guilds not only reinforced order, but also filled social gaps that the medieval era lacked. They organized charitable funds, supported widows, the sick, the disabled, or struggling craftsmen. When a workshop burned down, the guild helped rebuild. When a member died, they arranged burial. When an apprentice was orphaned, the guild became a guardian. The guild hall was not just a workplace, it was a political center, banquet hall, storage facility, court, and symbol of collective power. This control sometimes led to tense conflicts with other social groups, especially merchants. If craftsmen were the hands producing goods, merchants were the veins transporting, selling, and distributing products to distant markets. Initially, the two sides cooperated. Craftsmen needed merchants to sell goods, merchants needed craftsmen to maintain quality. But as guild power grew, conflict became inevitable. Merchants wanted freedom to trade and expand markets, while guilds sought to maintain monopoly, control products, and set prices. What seemed like economic disputes quickly turned into political conflicts. In some cities like Florence or Cologne, guilds achieved supreme power. They controlled the market, set rules, and regulated prices. In other cities like Genoa or Lubeck, merchants dominated due to economic power and international influence. The conflict between the two forces created a constant tension in urban life, sometimes leading to riots, protests, and even military intervention. Medieval cities became arenas of sophisticated power struggles, where every business decision, festival, feast, or ritual reflected the relationship between power and honor. However, the monopoly and strict control of guilds also led to social injustice. Migrants, women, and unlicensed workers were often excluded. Women played crucial roles in many trades. They brewed beer, wove cloth, baked bread, ran stalls. But most were not allowed full membership, could not vote, or train apprentices. Women were often only recognized in supportive roles or as inheritors of their husband's workshop upon his death, and still had to follow the guild's strict regulations. This is the dark side of a system seen as protecting order and quality. It preserved power for those already in the group, while shutting the door to newcomers. Thus, medieval guilds were not just professional organizations. They were the economic, social, and spiritual heart of cities, providing order and stability while creating conflict and limiting freedom. They combined honor, skill, power, and cultural norms, forming a unique system whose influence lasted for centuries. And it is precisely this complexity that made guilds one of the most important social innovations of the Middle Ages, with lessons about power, control, and community that remain relevant to this day. As the 14th century unfolded, Europe faced an unprecedented turning point. The guilds, once the centers of power in towns, now confronted a rapidly changing world where war, famine, plague, and political upheaval created challenges never seen before. The Black Death, with its terrifying devastation, not only claimed the lives of one-third of Europe's population, but also disrupted the entire labor structure. Workshops were left empty, masters died, apprentices vanished, and the streets once alive with the sounds of hammers and vendors fell into an eerie silence. In this context, surviving craftsmen, the fortunate masters, suddenly became the town's most valuable assets. The scarcity of labor gave them leverage and power unprecedented in the history of guilds. Guilds, which had strictly controlled labor supply, now found themselves courted by towns and local authorities. Skilled workers could demand higher wages, apprenticeship terms were renegotiated, and the authority of masters increased significantly. Authorities, fearing chaos and eager to restore production, relied on guilds to regulate prices, control supply, and ensure public order. Power was concentrated in the hands of masters like never before, creating a paradox. While the pandemic took lives, those who survived possessed immense power. But that power did not guarantee unity. Even at this peak, internal tensions simmered. Some craftsmen, elevated by the scarcity of labor, began challenging long-standing order. They formed small brotherhoods, sometimes directly confronting the master's authority, demanding fairer wages, reduced working hours, and greater participation in internal decisions. In response, masters tightened entry rules, increased apprenticeship fees, and reinforced their authority with determination. This struggle was not only economic, but also a social battle, where traditional values, professional honor, and loyalty were weighed against survival needs and fairness. While power was more concentrated than ever, guilds were still constrained by external forces. The rise of wealthy merchants, increasingly independent of guild structures, posed a direct challenge. They sponsored large scale projects, hired free labor, and ignored traditional regulatory rules. Markets expanded beyond the boundaries of individual towns, goods moved faster. From cloth from Bruges to spices from Venice, from sharp metal tools to new dyes. In the eyes of merchants, guilds became obstacles to growth and profit. Technology also put guilds in a difficult position. Improved weaving techniques, new metal machinery, or more efficient mechanical methods were often viewed with suspicion or prohibited because they threatened traditional practices. This created an internal conflict. While labor was scarce and demand high, guilds restricted innovation, protecting old order and traditional power. They became gatekeepers of the past, trying to maintain old standards while the world around them moved faster and faster. Political change added further pressure on guilds. Kings, eager for economic growth and centralized authority, began granting privileges directly to merchants, paving the way for new industries without guild approval. Some traditional powers of guilds in certain trades were reduced or dissolved, and commerce opened with fewer restrictions. The first capitalist entrepreneurs emerged. They sponsored textile workshops, metal workshops, mining projects, and operated according to principles of maximum efficiency. Free labor replaced the rigid apprenticeship system, production outpaced the capacity of traditional workshops, and gradually undermined long standing monopolies. Nevertheless, the influence of guilds persisted, though in a transformed form. They continued to train craftsmen, maintain rituals, festivals, and internal order. However, control over the market shifted from their hands to extensive trade networks and capitalist entrepreneurs. Guilds did not disappear, but they assumed a new role. No longer the absolute arbiters of economic life, they became guardians of tradition, quality standards, and professional identity. Their legacy still resonates today. The apprenticeship system established by guilds became the foundation for modern vocational education. Regulations on quality and consumer protection originated from standards set by guilds centuries earlier. Even modern labor unions reflect the model of medieval craft brotherhoods, advocating for rights, maintaining professional quality, and strengthening the labor community. Guilds may have faded from the center of power, but their blueprint, the combination of community, authority, and craft, still echoes in today's world. Remarkably, although their formal power declined, guilds left a strong spiritual legacy. The concepts of professional loyalty, respect for skill, and awareness of community persist in trades ranging from baking, tailoring, and metalworking to modern industrial workshops. They demonstrated that power lies not only in authority and control, but also in the ability to create a network connecting people through craft, ritual, and social responsibility. In the eyes of history, guilds are proof of how a professional organization can shape an entire economic, social, and cultural life. And even as their power waned, their influence endured for centuries. As Hurrem's power increasingly solidified, she realized that true strength in the Ottoman palace did not come solely from giving birth to a son, but also from the ability to manipulate the intricate network of power around her. Every action, every word, every smile became a strategic tool. She was not only the mother of a prince, but also a political architect, adept at balancing power among the concubines, advisors, court officials, and even foreign envoys. Every relationship was measured. Who was loyal, who only feigned loyalty, who could be bribed, who posed a potential threat. Hurrem learned to see through everything, turning intuition and intelligence into survival weapons in an environment rife with intrigue and suspicion. Inside the harem, the greatest threat did not come from the sultan but from other women of the court. Mahidien, the mother of Mustafa, was the most dangerous rival. She embodied the old power with long-standing influence and a son regarded as the obvious heir. Hurrem understood that to protect her position and her sons, she had to fight not only with beauty or the sultan's affection, but with intellect, patience, and sophisticated strategy. Every move by Mahidien was monitored, analyzed, and anticipated. Every word, every gesture was used by Hurrem to counterattack or create advantage. She learned to turn hatred, jealousy, and rivalry into political tools, thus navigating court conflicts to consolidate her influence. Beyond the harem, Hurrem extended her influence outward. She befriended scholars, physicians, and diplomats, turning each relationship into a link within her network of power. Envoys from Europe, Persia, and the Mediterranean quickly realized that to understand the shifts within Suleiman's court, they had to turn to Hurrem. She skillfully spread information, exerted influence, and at times controlled how news reached the Sultan. This soft power, the ability to manipulate information and perception, was something many concubines could never achieve, but Hurrem mastered with finesse. Meanwhile, political life in the harem remained fraught with mortal danger. Other concubines, advisors loyal to Mahidien, or officials protecting personal interests often sought to sabotage or trap Hurrem, but she learned to turn every challenge into opportunity. When a plot was discovered, she not only protected herself, but also cleverly turned adversaries into allies, or at least neutral parties. By combining personal power, relationships, and understanding court rules, she transformed the harem into a playing field where she always held the initiative. Every step Hurrem took was carefully calculated. When she bore another son, she not only strengthened her personal position, but also increased pressure on other concubines. The arrival of young princes forced Mahidien and other rivals to adjust their strategies, reduce power, or seek alliances against her. However, Hurrem was always one step ahead. She used affection, intelligence, and subtlety to reconcile, counter, or even manipulate internal alliances to her advantage. She was simultaneously mother, strategist, and guardian of morality and personal image, projecting an image both gentle and respected. The key to Hurrem's power was not only her understanding of people, but also her use of rules, tradition, and palace habits. She recognized that the unwritten laws of the harem, the ways concubines survived and fought, were powerful tools if properly employed. She applied her knowledge of protocol, music, poetry, and culture to generate charisma, influence emotions, and shape perceptions. While other concubines viewed rituals merely as obligations, Hurrem turned them into strategic tools. A glance, a smile, a word that was both humble and skillful could shift the balance of power. Not only a strategist within the court, she also shaped governance from behind the scenes. Suleiman, the powerful sultan, quickly realized that Hurrem was not just a lover, but an informal advisor. She influenced decisions on policy, security, diplomacy, and even the allocation of resources throughout the empire. Thanks to her trusted relationship with the Sultan, Hurrem could protect her children while expanding political influence beyond the harem, creating a more stable and centralized reign. But the greater the power, the higher the risk. The struggle among Suleiman's sons and rival concubines was an underground battle with life or death consequences. She knew that a small mistake could result in loss of power or even life. Therefore, every action was carefully considered, from interactions with other concubines, handling Mahidien, to deciding whom to trust and whom to monitor. Hurrem's strategic intelligence was her most important weapon, allowing her not only to survive, but also to shape the court's dynamics according to her will. From a girl taken as a slave into a world where power was measured by survival, Hurrem became a symbol of authority, intelligence, and influence in the Ottoman dynasty. She not only bore sons to solidify her position, but also transformed every relationship, every opportunity, and every action into part of a long-term power strategy. Hurrem stands as a living testament to the combination of intellect, ambition, and social skill in a harsh environment, where each day was a sophisticated battle and mastery of destiny. After the tragic death of Prince Mustafa, Hurrem Sultan was no longer on the sidelines of power. She became the center of the court, where every word, gesture, and decision shaped the destiny of the Ottoman Empire. With absolute power in her hands, Hurrem understood that to protect her children and maintain influence, she needed to employ a comprehensive strategy, combining politics, diplomacy, psychology, and culture. Every move she made was carefully considered, not just for today, but for decades to come. Within the palace, Hurrem's presence transformed the harem into a sophisticated political machine, where power was measured not only by the sultan's favor, but also by the ability to manipulate networks of relationships, grasp information, and control the emotions of those around her. Concubines, advisors, and scholars who once believed they could overwhelm her with long standing authority or the rigidity of traditional rules now had to be cautious in every action. Huram knew that in an environment where plots, rumors, and potential rivals were always lurking, silence was not safety. Only initiative could protect life and power. She quickly consolidated alliances with powerful figures outside the palace, something few concubines dared to dream of. Huram befriended viziers, talented advisors, and foreign envoys, building a wide reaching network of support. She used this influence to strengthen the position of her sons, particularly Salim and Bayezid, children bearing the responsibility of succession. Not only concerned with protecting herself and her children, Huram also shaped critical political, diplomatic, and military decisions from behind the scenes, becoming an unofficial but highly influential advisor to the Sultan. Beyond political strategy, Huram knew how to leverage public image to reinforce authority. She was not only a powerful woman in the court, but also a symbol of morality and piety. Charitable projects, the construction of mosques, schools, kitchens, and hospitals throughout Istanbul not only aided the people, but also built the image of a benevolent, respected queen. These public acts created a soft yet powerful layer of protection. Anyone wishing to oppose her had to confront public opinion, a force not to be underestimated in an empire where reputation and prestige could determine survival. Moreover, Huram was a master of diplomacy and political psychology. She corresponded with kings and foreign ambassadors, presenting her views sharply, clearly, and confidently. In these letters, she demonstrated awareness of international affairs, asserted the authority of someone standing beside the Sultan, and facilitated international political alliances. As a result, European powers, Persia, and neighboring states could not underestimate Huram. She became a center of influence that Ottoman diplomatic decisions had to consider. Huram's power did not stem solely from official authority, but also from her ability to read and manipulate the psychology of key figures in the palace. She recognized false loyalties, hidden plots, and exploited long standing suspicions within the court. Huram turned all information, whether rumor or fact, into a tool for navigating power. When needed, she sowed doubt among rivals. When necessary, she created temporary alliances to balance power. This ability made her not only the person behind the Sultan, but also the true architect of power in the empire. Her life was also a lesson in long term strategy. Huram understood that the throne could not be maintained indefinitely through current power alone. She had to secure her son's positions and prepare for threats from both inside and outside the palace. Every action, from observing Mahidien and other concubines to approaching high ranking officials, aimed to protect her children's survival and power. She made bearing sons a starting point, but real power came from intelligence, leadership, and understanding sophisticated politics. At the same time, Huram knew how to balance power and affection. Her relationship with the Sultan was not merely a political tool. She built genuine trust and closeness with the ruler. Through the combination of intellect, charm, and sincere emotion, Huram became a reliable advisor, partner, and life companion to Suleiman. It was this delicate interplay of power, influence, and emotion that enabled her to control a volatile court, where even the Sultan could be drawn into intricate plots and challenges from rival factions. As her sons grew, Huram continued to consolidate position and power, ensuring they were trained, protected, and placed in strategic roles. She built a strong generation of successors, not only through bloodline, but through knowledge, strategy, and careful preparation. Every move she made aimed to ensure that the empire not only survived political upheavals, but also maintained stability and development under her family's influence. Huram Sultan stands as a testament to the perfect combination of ambition, intellect, and strategy. She transformed herself from a female slave into the center of power, from a concubine into a legal wife and trusted advisor to the Sultan. Her actions not only changed the future of her children and the royal family, but also shaped the destiny of the entire empire. In Ottoman history, no woman had ever achieved such comprehensive influence and power as Huram, turning the palace into a political battlefield and becoming an enduring symbol of authority, intellect, and timeless influence. As Huram Sultan entered the peak of her power, She was not only the center of the palace, but also became the architect of the Ottoman Empire's destiny. With exceptional political skill, she transformed every action and decision into a strategic move, from direct influence over the Sultan to a wide reaching impact on distant provinces. No longer a weak and submissive servant, she became a symbol of power and political finesse, where intellect, courage, and strategy converged to protect her family and consolidate the dynasty. One of the key areas Hurrem leveraged to expand her power was charity and public works. She understood that authority did not stem solely from the throne or the Sultan's favor, but also from public reputation. Architectural projects, mosques, schools, charitable kitchens, and hospitals under her direction not only met the practical needs of the people, but also established her image as a refined, visionary, and benevolent patron. The HKI complex, the most prominent among them, served as a living testament to this philosophy, providing housing, education, and medical care for thousands, while affirming that Hurrem's power was not only palace intrigue, but also a presence in the daily lives of the populace. In doing so, she mitigated rumors of conspiracies and private power, making herself both respected and approachable. Alongside public influence, Hurrem was a sophisticated strategist within the palace politics. She understood the power structure of the Ottoman court. Positions such as Grand Vizier, Viziers, or eunuchs played key roles in administering the empire. Rustam Pasha, her son-in-law and close ally, served as Grand Vizier and became an important tool for Hurrem to shape military decisions, tax reforms, and foreign policy. Their cooperation created an unprecedented model of female power. Hurrem protected her and her children's interests while subtly guiding the empire from behind the scenes, blurring the line between harem politics and the art of governance. Within the harem, Hurrem implemented significant reforms. She reorganized the roles of the concubines, ensuring they were well trained and loyal, while consolidating the management system of attendants. Through a combination of generosity and strategy, she transformed the harem from a mere residence into a disciplined, efficient, and politically significant institution. This shifted the balance of power in a palace historically dominated by men, where councils, viziers, and military campaigns dictated all outcomes. Hurrem demonstrated that a woman born a slave could shape an entire political system. Hurrem's influence extended to the royal life. She was a trusted advisor to Suleiman, whom she accompanied throughout his life. Their relationship, beginning as an unexpected romance between the Sultan and a female slave, developed into a deep bond where Hurrem became a life partner, companion, and protector of the dynasty. This trust allowed her to directly influence crucial decisions, from domestic to foreign policy, from military matters to succession strategy. Her letters and directives demonstrated that even in the Sultan's absence, Hurrem managed the empire's affairs with remarkable authority. As her sons grew, Hurrem continued to consolidate her position by training and strategically guiding them. Selim and Bayezid, each with different personalities and strengths, were instructed to prepare for the challenges of the throne. She knew her power would only endure if her children were protected and aligned, and she would not allow any threats from opposition factions or internal suspicions to undermine their positions. Mikremer, her daughter, also became a key political ally, continuing her mother's vision and strategy, reinforcing a female power that began to shape court decisions. Although Hurrem's power and influence reached their peak, she still faced the challenges of time, illness, and grief. Her health declined, yet she did not withdraw from political affairs or oversight of public projects. Her final letters show a woman still sharp, decisive, and strategic, despite battling pain and fatigue. She supervised charitable funds, mediated political disputes, directed her sons and networks of allies, ensuring that her power and influence remained strong even in her final years. Hurrem's enduring influence extended beyond her life and authority. She broke barriers separating harem women from state politics, paving the way for an era in which mothers, wives, and royal daughters became decisive figures in diplomacy, education, architecture, and succession. Women in the palace no longer lived in seclusion or relied solely on whispers. They became strategic planners, inheriting the political and cultural legacy that Hurrem created. The Ottoman dynasty after her changed. Charity, patronage, correspondence, and the role of motherhood became instruments of power and governance. Hurrem Sultan's legacy stands as a testament to the perfect combination of intellect, strategy, and courage. Controversial though she may have been, she is recognized as the woman who permanently transformed the Ottoman palace. She not only protected her children and family, but also reshaped the court, strengthened the dynasty, and ushered in an era historians later called the Kingdom of Women. Hurrem's power, influence, and vision lived on through her children and the system she established, proving that from a female slave, a woman could become the heart, intellect, and strategy of the most powerful empire of her time.